to everybody, and I would like to thank everybody for your valuable presence over here, and we hope to have a very interactive session today. May I call my colleague Mr. Uday Mehta for the introductory note, please.
Thank you, Rachna. So good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to see all of you here for this important event. So to begin with, this event, for some of you who may not know this, is being organized under the flagship of the CUTS Washington Center, which we inaugurated last year in April, which is the 6th overseas center of CUTS. In the context of this event, let me just put forth some important points and which would also set the base and the tone for the panel discussion and the speech by Mr. Frank Islam. To begin with, India and the United States of America have a long-standing economic and strategic partnership, which I'm sure all of us in this room do understand that and do acknowledge that, which is shaped by a diverse range of factors such as deep-rooted economic values and convergence of interest on bilateral, regional, and also global issues. Let me focus on few figures just for the benefit of this discussion, which will also allow us to ascertain whether the magical figure of USD $500 billion, which is the target and which is also the focus of today's event, whether it is achievable or not in this context. Between the year 2000 and 2017, the total trade in goods and services between India and the United States increased from USD $19.1 billion to USD $126.2 billion, more than six-fold increase with a compound annual growth rate of 11.75%. However, in order to increase our bilateral trade more than fourfold, that is the target which is USD $500 billion by 2025, the rate of growth has to be close to approximately 18.78%. So we are currently at 11.75%, but the target is 18.78%. It's not impossible, but it is challenging in its own ways. In order to achieve this target, we have to make sure that we address few critical issues. First, USA's suspension of GSP benefits to India, which is worth USD close to 70 million a year, does hurt both the economies. This is because a large volume of American imports from India under the GSP scheme boosts the competitiveness of American manufacturers. Let me also touch a little bit more on the trade deficit between India and the US, which largely remains always an irritant in its own ways. According to a CUTS research conducted last year, the US trade deficit with India was not as large as it appeared. In 2016, in terms of goods trade, the US trade deficit with India was close to USD $22 billion, which is mere 2.7% of the total US trade deficit, which stands at close to USD 798 billion with the world that year. Other contentious issues which still remains to be debated and deliberated are India's policy on data localization, the rules amending foreign direct investments in e-commerce. Without getting too much into the details of these issues, and I'm sure all of you must be aware that the government of India has just come out with the draft e-commerce policy, which I'm sure some of us will be reviewing very closely. It appears that these might hinder the growth of application of innovative technologies, which might cause disruption in the global supply chain. Thus, we need to adopt a middle path, balancing India's security needs with the economic interest of those of our partners, including India and the US. Lastly, the dispute settlement mechanism is an important pillar of the World Trade Organization. The decrease in serving members is likely to cause further delays in the appellate proceedings. So that's another important issue which India and the United States must work together to ensure that the impasse is ended. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that an open, transparent, and predictable business environment, along with strong governing institutions, are extremely important aspects of our partnership, which can result in achieving more and more shared prosperity. With that, thank you very much, and we look forward to an extremely engaging session this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Uday. Now let us all welcome Mr. Frank Islam, who everybody knows is a very dynamic entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a civic leader who believes in giving back to the society, ensuring prosperity for everybody. He is an inspiration to many in US as well as in India, and he serves as a very successful example of a fruitful benefit and mutually viable partnership. I call upon Mr. Frank Islam for his speech, please.
How do I go there? Sorry about that. This is the first stumble, so I'm not doing very well. So how do I, okay, so it's a little bit, and so I can flip it on my pages here when I give speech. So I'm delighted to be here. And the purpose of my trip to come to India to inaugurate Frank and Debbie Islam Auditorium, Aligarh Muslim University, and where I have contributed $2.5 million. Unfortunately, because of the unrest, I was not able to go there. But I have a lot of other engagements. So this one is one of the best engagement that I have, and I'm leaving tomorrow. It's wonderful to see people like Robert and Mr. Shah, who happens to be a neighbor. I did not realize that. On the Lower Road, right? Yes, that's right. Yeah, wonderful. So stop over and see me next time. I'm not sure you can get in there, but I will try my best. So good afternoon, and distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. You know, I should have her everywhere for my introduction. She does a really good job. Thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words. And thank you for your warm welcome and your hospitality. It is truly an honor to be here with all of you. And thank you, Uday. Where's Uday? Our friend. Uday Mehta and Pradeep Mehta, father and son, to inviting me to speak and bring us, all of us together. They lighten our load and they lift our spirit. They are true inspiration to all of us. They inspired all of us to do well, but to do good. So let's give them a big round of applause. And thank you to all of the distinguished guests for joining us today. I also want to thank Tarun Basu, who's a dear friend of mine. He is a leader. He has made a lot of difference, and he's also established the wire services called Indo-Asian Wire Service, where I write columns every month in Inclusive India and a column. So thank you, Tarun, for joining us today. Thank you very much. I also want to express my deep gratitude to Pradeep Mehta for inviting me to serve on the Kutch Advisory Board alongside so many illustrious individuals. It is truly an honor. And thank you, Uday, for your leadership and for all you do to inspire all of us. Before I make my formal remarks, let me state for the record that I do not speak on behalf of any organization or agency of the United States government. My comments are made as a proud citizen of the United States. I mention that because I have served on many advisory boards when President Obama was the President of the United States for the US Government Department in the past. I also served on the board of the trustees, the Kennedy Center, and many other organizations, including Wilson Center and Brookings Center. Let me also state that I'm here to speak not as a geopolitical expert, not as an international relations scholar, not as an economist, but as a civically engaged Indian business, an Indian American business person whose motherland is in India, who love India, and whose homeland is the United States of America. And I love America. What's best in me, I owe it to India and the United States. I love both countries and recognize that they are by far the two largest democracies in the world. And the future of these democracies is central to the future of democracies and democratic values. Democratic and diversity are the two values that binds us together, that brings us together. And when we are together, we can help shape a better future for the world. I recognize that neither the US nor India is perfect, far from it. But I firmly believe that if these two countries can cooperate and form the right kind of strategic relations on matters of all types, they can be the standard bearer and standard setters, improving the lives of the citizens in their responsible country and collaborating to make the world a better and a fairer place. That is my perspective. Now let me turn to the heart of the matter, my thoughts on the state of the India-US relation, past, present, and the future. For purpose of this task, I have divided the past state of those relations into two periods, from 1995 to 1990, and from 1990 to 2016. I've classified the present state as the period for the Trump presidency in the United States, which at this moment is from 2017 to 2020. And I look at the future state from 2020 going forward. In my remarks, I will present a historical overview of the past, a snapshot of the present, and my top-line assessment for the future. I must admit this is a daunting task, as it will take volumes and volumes to give these relations a full and a proper treatment. I'm aware that many of you are extremely knowledgeable and intimately familiar with the history of US-India relation. Therefore, I will not go into detail on the past state. Indeed, I will highlight some important historical issues and background and concentrate the bulk of my attention on the present and the future states. My goal is to provide the proper context for our distinguished panel to carry forward the discussion. So that said, let me begin by examining the years from 1947 to 1990. I have labeled that period the fledgling relationship between India and the United States. When India became independent in 1947, shortly after the World War II, the US-led bloc of democratic nations and the USSR-led communist bloc were vying for influence globally. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, chose to pursue an independent foreign policy from a group of nations called the Non-Aligned Movement. New Delhi called itself a non-aligned nation that in reality tilted towards Moscow. Because of this, India and the United States were essentially indifferent to each other. There was cooperation in several fields such as higher education and agriculture, but relations were not great politically. The ties reached their lowest during the 1970s. This was primarily due to three issues. Number one, the first issue was the India-Pakistan war over Bangladesh liberation, with India supporting Bangladesh and US supporting Pakistan. The second issue that resulted in the escalation of tension between India and the United States was India's detonation of nuclear bombs in 1974. The third issue was the growing economic nationalism in India throughout the 1970s, which saw the nationalization of some sectors of the economy and forcing American companies such as Coca-Cola and IBM to close their India operations. The late 1970s brought the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan to make South Asia a theater in the Cold War. This increased America's financial and military support to Pakistan. After the turbulent 1970s, relations between India and the US were very quiet throughout 1980s. Let me now turn the period from 1990 to 2016, which I had labeled the strengthening relationship between India and the United States. As you all know, relations between the two countries have improved dramatically since the 1990s. There are many factors that have driven that improvement. I want to highlight three: the end of Cold War, the liberalization of India's economy, and the growing influence of the Indian American diaspora community in the United States. I will analyze each of these factors briefly. Number one, the end of Cold War meant that the New Delhi has to build a better relationship with Washington, and it began doing so. The rise of China over the past decade and one half have accelerated their relationship development. And the US-India civil nuclear agreement constructed during the Bush administration and the tenures of Prime Minister Vajpayee and Prime Minister Singh signal a new direction in US-India relations, which has been built upon since the US-India nuclear deal was signed in 2008. The second part, the Indian economy was liberalized in 1991 in response to an acute financial crisis. Because of that liberalization, American businesses flocked to India. Those businesses have used their economic, political, and financial might to improve the US relations with India. The third, the Indian-American community has grown exponentially both in numbers and influence since the 1990s. The game changer for Indian immigration was the high-tech revolution of the 1990s. Thanks to H-1B visa, more than 1 million Indians have immigrated to the United States in the past 25 years. Over the years, those immigrants have become permanent residents of the United States and citizens, and thus part of the US political system. They began making campaign donations, voting for candidates of their choice, and lobbying for their elected representative. They have become a powerful and vocal lobbying force advocating for better relations with India. I firmly believe that Indian diaspora have the capacity, the capability, and the responsibility to help India to achieve its fullest potential. Those are the three factors that contributed substantially to the strengthening of India and the United States relations between 1990 to the end of 2016. That brings me to the present, the time period from January 20th, 2017, when President Trump took office as the president until his first term is scheduled to be completed on January 20th, 2021. I have labeled this period the erratic relationship between India and the United States. I struggled with what to name the relationship. Other words that came to my mind included unilateral, chaotic, and isolationist. I selected erratic not because it applied just to US-India relations, but because I believe it fairly characterizes all relations, both international and in the United States during the Trump presidency. Nothing is for certain. Everything is dependent on the mood and understanding of President Trump. There's no art to the deal. It's all about getting it your way and winning. Collaboration and compromise under this administration are dirty words. Even though there have been much progress and considerable strengthening of India-US relations for the past decade, there were still several serious issues on which the United States and India had their differences when Trump became the president of the United States. India's relations with Iran, which is an enemy of America, is one such issue. Similarly, US-Pakistan relations are seen with the skepticism in India. Though the United States has been tough on Pakistan since the 9/11, New Delhi thinks Washington can and should do more to fight terrorism. India has also been unhappy over the US restriction on H-1B visas, which has affected Indian IT companies doing business in the United States. Under the Trump administration, life has become even tougher for these firms. The slow pace of the economic reform in India continues to frustrate American businesses. Robert? A lot was expected from the Prime Minister Modi, but he has failed to live up to the expectation so far, much to the disappointment of American businesses. He has not replicated the success he has had in Gujarat at the national level. I'm not here to complain or criticize the Prime Minister Modi. He is a very strong, savvy, and smart man. He is committed to strengthen and broaden and deepen India's engagement to the United States of America. Even in the best of the time, Washington has become unhappy over protectionism, weak intellectual property rights, and lack of market access to US companies in India. But the protectionist debate has taken a new turn with America itself turning protectionist under President Trump. The victory of Trump in the 2016 presidential election has had a disruptive effect on America's ties with India. I should note, though, that the degree of disruption has been much less compared to the US relations and ties with some other traditional allies as the Europeans, Germany, Canada, and Mexico. Even though President Trump campaigned on an America First domestic and foreign policy, India placed high hopes on the incoming president. In fact, India was one of the few countries that was cautiously optimistic about Trump in January 2017. Prime Minister Modi had a positive visit to Washington during Trump's first year in office. And Modi seems to have gotten along well with Trump. However, subsequently, not much has been accomplished. This is true in all areas, but it is especially true in terms of the trade relations. One of the continuing successes in India-US relationship has been the ever-growing trade in goods. Last year, the bilateral trade tops $73 billion. In my opinion, though, India and the US are punching way below their weight on trade. Nonetheless, considering when things were, that is an impressive number. In 1991, the year India initiated liberalization of its economy, the bilateral trade was a little over $5 billion. I know that one of the cuts objective, as Uday has outlined, is to bolster US trade economic relations to achieve the target of $500 billion. Based upon the research that I have reviewed, and I think that is a realistic and achievable target within the next decade. Given the erratic failure of the current relationship, however, I do not expect much progress to be made towards that goal over the next 2 years. That's my personal opinion. Having said that, my counsel is to not give up hope, but to work diligently to set the stage for accelerated progress in the next decade. As I said in the article published in the press here in India in November of last year, and I must quote what I said, India must stay the course in its trade relations with the US. It must keep cool, keep calm, and carry on. By doing so, it will make itself a winner and bring the US along with it. Although I do not believe India's persistence will pay off in the next 2 years, that's my personal feeling, I'm confident that it will pay off big time in the next decade. That is why I have labeled the period from 2021 going forward as the partnership relation between India and the United States. I believe that is the right label, not as an optimist, but as a realist who, because of my personal history and bifocal view as an Indian American, can see beyond today's murkiness. Let me elaborate on that. In the years since I came to the United States, I have seen India-US relations at their worst. I have seen them get much better. In my early years in the United States, I watched from a distance the Bangladesh Liberation War and the subsequent India-Pakistan War. The US establishment support and American popular opinion were against India. That was followed by the nationalization of the key sectors of the economy by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and India's first successful nuclear test in Pokhran in 1974. Again, they were not popular in the United States. Believe me, it was not an easy time to be an Indian American student in the United States in the early 1970s. Fast forward to January 2015, when President Obama visited New Delhi as the chief guest of the 66th Republic Day celebration. I was part of the US business delegation that accompanied him on Air Force One. I witnessed firsthand the love the Indian public expressed for the American president. I was touched. A year and a half later, when Prime Minister Modi visited Washington to address the joint session of the United States Congress, I was there to witness the warm welcome from America and the American Congress, whether they're Democrats, Republican, or Independent. Given this, I have no doubt that Indian-US tie will continue to grow despite the isolationist and protectionist policies of the Trump administration. Trump and Trumpism will not alter America's DNA permanently. What makes me think this and that the future of bilateral relations will be bright? The reasons are the same factors and driving forces that I spelled out for the improvement of ties since the 1990s, and they are, number one, our shared democratic values and common geopolitical interest. As I mentioned earlier, it was a geopolitical interest that drove the United States and India closer at the beginning of this millennium. The two countries will continue to share a bond as pluralistic and inclusive democracy with a shared sense of values and goals. Number two, trade and commerce. Trade and commerce has always been powerful forces that brought societies and countries together. As I said, I think $500 billion in terms of US-India trade is imminently doable. Some experts have even predicted that US-India trade could touch the $1 trillion mark by 2030. And I hope it is true, because I like to see our trade get to by 2030 to the $1 trillion. Number three, the presence of the ever-growing and influential Indian American community in the United States. By the time the next US Census takes place, the Indian American population will have crossed the 4 million mark. Additionally, several hundred thousand Indian immigrants are waiting to become permanent residents of the United States and eventually United States citizens. During his historic visit to India in November of 2010, President Barack Obama declared that, and I quote, "We are two free market economies where people have the freedom to pursue ideas and innovation that can change the world." President Obama continued to state, and that is why I believe that India and America are indispensable partners in meeting the challenges of our time. I agree with President Obama's viewpoint, and that is why I have labeled the period from 2021 going forward as the partnership relationship time for India and the United States. I also understand the future is promised to no one. India and the US must work together to earn their level and their future. This session and the work of the Kurds is testimony to the fact that the work is underway. Thanks to Kurds for allowing me to make a small contribution to that process. I look forward to hearing the panel, to gaining new insight that can be employed to create the best possible relationship between the United States and India. After that, I look forward to working with all of you in the future to construct an agenda for achieving that relationship. In closing, thanks for listening to me and letting me share my thoughts with you. God bless you, God bless India, and God bless the United States of America.
I'll figure it out how to get out of here.
Thank you, Mr. Islam, for a very detailed and concise description of India-US bilateral relation. It has briefed us as to where we will and where we have to go. Now I call upon Mr. Pradeep Mehta, the Secretary General for Kurds International, to moderate a panel discussion. The eminent people in the panel include Mr. Phil Shaw, the CEO for Lockheed Martin India, Ms. Ambika Sharma, Managing Director India for US-India Business Council, Mr. Robert Gavrik, Minister Council for Economic Affairs, Environment, Science and Technology from US Embassy, New Delhi. Over to you, Mr. Mehta, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachna. And let me also add to Uday's welcome to all of you to this event, which, as you would have heard, the brilliant speech made by Frank Islam, and we are quite encouraged to follow your advice. And I personally feel that your speech can be a very good reading material for students of US-India relationship. The way you summarized it, particularly in the modern day of Twitter, etc., short speech makes a very good reading rather than a thick book. So an excellent summary. Let me just, Mr. Santosh Sarangi, the Joint Secretary of the Ministry of Commerce, is going to join us a little later. He's been summoned by the minister, so I'm told. Koda would know what happens when ministers call you for this particular thing. But just a few points I would like to make. My own understanding about the US-India relationship, particularly in the context of Indian diaspora. I think what has been under-researched or understated, Mr. Islam, is the net contribution made by the Indian diaspora to the US economy. That's a very huge export we have done. And when you say that the kind of H-1B visa or the high-tech issues, this was Nehru's vision that he established the Indian Institutes of Technology. IIT is a very major contributor to the American economy, and therefore one has to do a proper research as to find out as to what it is worth. I mean, we are exporting our brain power. Some of it is, we are talking about brain gain, but at the same time there is one under-researched area. Now, even in terms of H-1B, there has been a lot of research which has shown that the US economy has been a net gainer in the sense. FICCI, etc., put out studies on that. I'm sure Ambika will recall. Ambika has been with FICCI for a very long time. Now, therefore, one cannot ignore the fact is that it is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. I mean, it's like the famous maxim that exports are good and imports are bad, which is of course totally wrong. I mean, imports are also very good. Depends on what you do with the imports and how you take it forward in terms of as intermediates to your manufacturing process or consumer welfare or whatever, what have you. I'm particularly intrigued and very encouraged, I would say, by your comment that we should look at a target of $1 trillion by the year 2030, and I'm sure we can do that. Provided that some of these steps which the US administration has taken at the particular moment, or the Trump administration to be precise, is something which needs to be revisited with that holistic target in mind. For example, the GSP benefits. So we are all very disturbed in India that the GSP benefits will be withdrawn. Now, there again, studies have shown that the GSP benefits do benefit the American economy in a big way. Now, when Uday spoke about $22 billion trade deficit, we did a study to look at the trade deficit as to what is it actually. Now, OECD and WTO have a database to look at the kind of impact of the imports on your economy. And we found it's a little complex economic issue, but we found that the actual deficit is only around $3 billion. If you look at the value added to the deficit, so it's not $22 billion actually. I mean, this is on the basis of scientific data which has been done by the OECD/WTO. Now, what I thought was, these are some important things which need to be publicized. We've done papers on that, which has been published also, but they need to be publicized. And trade deficit by itself is not bad. In India, it has a trade deficit with China in a big way. And we continue to have a trade deficit with China, but do we stop trading? This goes to the larger political point in the sense that Government of India policy where there is a national consensus is to keep this thing to on. We are not going to send our army to go and fight any kind of war. We do use it for UN peacekeeping forces, but that's beside them. Trump has asked India to participate in Afghanistan. We are not going to do that. And as Narendra Modi, Prime Minister, has said very clearly, that we follow strategic autonomy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a national consensus in India. We'll keep good relations with China, Russia, or Iran, or anyone as else possible. It doesn't mean that it will be at the cost of our friendship with the US. we'll continue to deepen our relation with the US, which was quite evident in the Indo-US nuclear accord of which you spoke about, for which Manmohan Singh nearly lost his seat, if you remember. The government was going to fall, but he stuck by it. And one of those rare things for which Manmohan Singh has some kind of reputation that he could stick to that particular thing so hard that Dr. Sanjay Baru, who was his media advisor at that point of time, was expected to come, but unfortunately got held up. I still remember tweeting at Begaman, putting out an SMS on the phone, saying is king. The moment the parliament could survive, in the sense that. So I'm just recalling some of these instances which are very important in the context of US-India relations, that they are not a one-way street, they are a two-way street, and that needs to be understood. What US has done on China is welcome. Quite evidently it is welcome because the Chinese have taken advantage of the WTO in a big way, and particularly through its kind of state subsidies, etc., allowed its steel industry, etc., etc. I mean, there are many such issues which we must look at, and there are many commentators who have written about it as well. Welcome. And there are many commentators who have welcomed the move which US has made on China, but to use the same weapon against Europe or India is something which I don't think is a very smart idea, as we rightly pointed out, this kind of protectionism. What boils to protectionism, whatever has happened. Now, now since we have our panel which is full and we've got a very limited time, it's about 5:40, and we have, well, we're supposed to be about 10 minutes late, but I hope we can make up by then. We have 4 panelists with us, and I'd like to welcome all of them. So, Phil Shaw on my left, Chief Executive of Lockheed Martin India Private Limited. Ambika Sharma, Managing Director of India-US India Business Council. Santosh Kumar Sarangi, Joint Secretary in the Department of Commerce, who looks after Americas. Robert Gavrik, Minister Council for Economic Affairs, Environment, Science and Technology, US Embassy, etc. Welcome to all of you. Let me now begin. How long would you like? 5 to 7 minutes?
Should be able to.
There you go. So then we can try and have as much floor discussion as possible. Some of the points which Frank has made and invited us to react to them would be very helpful, very nice. Phil, over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to sit on the panel this evening to discuss the grand aim of both of our governments to increase trade from where it's at today, 120 odd billion, up to 500 billion, but as Frank has said, it's a much bigger target of $1 trillion in the coming years. The industry sector I represent is defence and aerospace, and this is an area where we've seen a significant shift in the last 10 years, rising from about $100 million to around $17 billion of trade today. And I think there are promising signs, as Mr. Islam pointed out in his talk, of this trend continuing as both of our countries deepen their defence and security relationship. Both countries share mutual security concerns and interests, and the support for the relationship appears to be bipartisan, as was also pointed out in both countries. So there's no reason to believe that the relationship won't develop further in terms of military-to-military linkages, as well as industry-to-industry collaboration in future years. Possessing the largest defence corporations globally, the USA presents Indian industry with a unique opportunity to become integrated into the largest supply base for defence equipment in the world. Some of the initiatives, such as the Defence Technology and Trade Initiative, are attempting to forge greater levels of collaboration between our industries. This programme is looking at opportunities to co-produce and co-develop capabilities for both of our armed forces. With a focus on Make in India, there's a drive towards developing India's defence industrial base in both the public and private sectors. Companies such as mine took a decision around a decade ago to partner with a local Indian firm and co-produce some of our products. We team with Tata Advanced Systems in Hyderabad to manufacture aerostructures, and as a result have a mature decade-long partnership that supplies S-92 helicopter cabins and C-130J tail empennages to our global supply chain. We announced the delivery of our 100th C-130J tail empennage from Hyderabad last week. In addition, over the last 10 years, we've managed to indigenize the majority of components that are assembled in Hyderabad. At the beginning of our operation, many of the components had to be imported as there was no obvious source for them in the country. However, that situation has changed, and as the capabilities of local industry became better known to us, and from further investments that we and our partner have made, we've enabled the bulk of components to be made here locally. Further, we've been able to add additional work, such as the announcement to manufacture fighter wings in our plant in Hyderabad. Work is underway today to transition that work to India. Despite some of the initial infrastructure issues we faced, all of our products from Hyderabad have arrived on time and on budget and are of a high quality. While we were the first US defense company to take this step, several others have more recently followed in our footsteps to benefit from the skilled workforce that we've developed over the years. Consequently, what started as a couple of factories in the middle of fields is now growing into a community of industry and residential units with all that comes along with that. I highlight these examples because I believe it demonstrates in a relatively small scale what can be done between our two industries should we proceed to work on much larger projects and platforms in the future. So how do we move this relationship forward and develop our trade links still further? Obviously, there is a drive by the government of India to develop its own industry through Make in India, to provide a greater degree of self-reliance for the support of defense equipment. Equally, there is a drive by the USA to sustain and grow its manufacturing capabilities. Many countries around the world have similar demands, and where we've partnered with countries in the past and industries in the past, our experience is that both countries' industries benefit from collaborative programs, and so there is no real conflict. The benefit to Indian industry presented by collaboration with the USA, as I said before, is that we have the benefit of providing access to the largest defense and aerospace supply chains in the world. And so while each individual country's defense procurements tend to be lumpy or episodic, being able to join a much larger supply base tends to offer a more sustainable model on which to build a stronger defense and aerospace capability. Another area where I believe we can add value, which will lead to an increase in trade, will be to collaborate more on research and development in defense and aerospace. One program that we as a company have been engaged with in India is the India Innovation and Growth Program in partnership with the Department of Science and Technology, and more recently Tata Trust joined the team. This program is currently entering its 13th year, and during that time we've seen the program grow in terms of the number of innovator and startup applicants, which when we launched in 2007 was a mere 100 to last year's 3,000 applications. In the first 9 years, according to an EY report, the program generated circa $800 million revenue for the innovators in India, and 400 business arrangements were developed. In parallel with this program, and now combined with it for the last few years, we've been running a university challenge where university teams compete in an aerospace and defense project, and the program supports the winners to continue with their research or even to develop a prototype product. Yeah, just about to. Two great examples from this program were recently acknowledged down at Aero India last week. My suggestion, therefore, when identifying a roadmap to increase trade between our two countries is to identify more programs where we can collaborate on in both manufacturing and research and development. Co-production and co-develop models present an ideal opportunity to increase trade in both directions, while aligning or increasing our alignment on defense and security technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And one of the reasons, as anybody would have noticed, we invited Lockheed Martin's Bill here for the simple reason that they have actively participated in the Make in India program also, which is what is the Government of India policy. That defense is, of course, a very big sector, and one of the few American companies which is situated here, and we go to expand into the latest Bangalore. Can you put all your mobiles on silent or switch it off? Thank you. is that they have now launched a new model F-21, which they said they will produce in India, and India can become a big exporter of this particular aircraft. So we think it is very important for our economy as well. Ambika, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much, Mr. Mehta. My fellow panelists on the dais, Mr. Islam, Uday. You've already set a good context with giving the trade figures, so I'm not going to repeat, but I'll make a small mention. It's a great honor for me on behalf of the US-India Business Council, which is the largest bilateral body representing the US and Indian companies who do business with each other. Today's topic is very close to our hearts because this has been a focus for the US IBC for the year 2019, not only for the 2019, and taking our target to $500 billion by 2025, which is nearly 5 times, is a huge target. And we have launched a study jointly with CII, and we look forward to working with CUTS how to achieve that. But I would like to share some views with the audience today. Uday, you very rightly mentioned that United States and India view each other as the important strategic partners to advance common interest. And currently our trade has reached $126 billion. And total export growth rate, which is 15.5% in 2017, is more than triple from the average export growth rate of 4.8%, achieved over the 5 years, while total imports have also risen by 7.4%, increasing from the average import growth rate of 5.2%. So we are on the growth trajectory. Trade relationship between India and US, has rightly been put it by Sir you in your inaugural speech, is very consequential for not only for India but for the United States, because we hold this trade figures in our global trade is of great importance. Phil, you talked about the defense, and defense sales are very significant in bilateral trade. While defense trade does not add up to the overall trade figures, our two nations have signed defense contracts worth more than $15 billion since 2008, up to $500 million as it is available. So it's very, very significant part. We are all aware that bilateral trade frictions that impede the trajectory of trade growth exist on numerous fronts. Some brief mentions have been made by my previous speakers. Issues have been touched upon which relate to trade imbalance, tariff issues, the GSP regime, and the IPR regime concerns. There have been concerns on the access of each other's markets, especially concerns from India too, on movement of professionals which hinder the growth of the service sector, market access in agriculture, localization, trade barriers and regulatory issues. From the US IBC, we would like, looking at all these issues and a huge potential which exists and the target which we have set, I would suggest a 5-point agenda in terms of a working strategy as a working paper. We must look at first identifying tariffs on products on both sides that hurt trade, and find bilateral solutions to resolve the tariff issues. We must identify barriers to services export on both sides and create platforms which boost trade in services. The third agenda which we would like to propose from the US IBC is to identify specific sectors where SMEs in India and US can collaborate to build value chains for tapping global markets for products and services. Fourth, keep the dialogue process open on changes in regulations and policies, and there's no doubt about it because this is very much on, and Mr. Sarangi would be speaking about it. Fifth, identify products of interest on both sides to harmonize standards so that non-tariff barriers are removed from trade. So some of the other suggestions on behalf of the US IBC, I would just like to mention that to promote investment, which is also growing between India and the United States, we should look at the global supply chain. I think you had made a brief reference of that, and you did also speak about it. US IBC is also working very closely with our Ministry of Commerce and Industry, particularly the newly named DPIIT, on ease of doing business. So we are focusing on boosting investment between India and the United States. One of the key roles of the US Embassy is also to keep the narrative positive and facilitate the commercial dialogue, the trade policy forum, the CO forum, and the high technology forum, the energy dialogues, the numerous dialogues which are already existing between India and the United States. Given the current trade discussions which are happening between US and China, we at US IBC very strongly proposes that India can be an important partner for industry in US to create value chains that can be a win-win for both sides. US IBC supports the focus of USG on a greater Indo-Pacific strategy where India is not only for the strategic linchpin of the region but also for the economic driver. I think these points are very key when we look at a huge target which is just behind the backdrop. So I would like to also mention about trade diversification, because diversification of trade basket is very important, and we should try to look at some high value technology embedded trade like aerospace, ICT and electronics to be added into our trade baskets. Commercial aircrafts and civil aviation sector need actually a special mention, and it could be a great fillip to bilateral trade, with India having an order pipeline of 300 large and small aircrafts from US companies with further growth expected in this area. These issues are very important to look at a huge target as to how we close this. And finally, a very important word on the energy market, because it's a great balancer for our trade. US shares of energy market is still low, though recent crude oil exports from the US is helping boost trade. For India's energy security, the oil and gas trade can not only bridge a huge gap in the trade, but help in creation of necessary infrastructure on both sides. So we look at, we give a lot of importance on the energy trade as part of its whole big trade initiative. In the end, let me just close it by focusing on the 5 specific suggestions. The very first suggestion is that strategizing market access for services in India. A dialogue just on services trade within the ambit of the US-India Trade Policy Forum, I think we can go a long way in this context. Re-energizing dialogue on skilled...
Excuse me, sir. Market access for services into India?
Yes, in India, insurance, financial services, tourism and transport. And re-energizing dialogue on skilled labor mobility in a way that is de-linked from the permanent immigration. Third, we must reinitiate our dialogue on good manufacturing practices with regulatory authorities from US FDA. And this I'm talking with particular reference to the India's agriculture products, marine products and the pharmaceuticals in particular. Fourth, launching a high technology manufacturing forum that could include co-development and co-production in defense and aerospace, which is very, very important. And the last, but the most important, is sustaining and expanding our dialogue on standards. So I conclude by saying that for India and United States to reach the preferred trade volumes, a huge target, the backdrop in front of which we are all sitting, narrow regulations and protectionism may not be the right answer, and people, goods, information, data needs to be able to flow freely if our potential needs to be fulfilled. Thank you, Mr.
Excellent. That was an excellent speech. And fortuitously, the issue that you highlighted is something which is there on our mind as well. And we've been working with US IBC since a long time, including Nisha Bishwal, who is the head of US IBC in Washington, DC, was there at our opening ceremony in DC on 19th of April. So we are, in fact, and they've encouraged us to continue to work with them, particularly on many of the research agendas that I think we can contribute to your roadmap very well. Mr. Sarangi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mehta. Dignitaries on the dais, off the dais. I don't have a prepared speech. I think Ms. Ambika was very organized, so I must apologize. But I know, with so many known faces, I know the combined intellectual depth, combined intellectual base present in this room is pretty huge. And to talk to an audience about India-US relationship doesn't make much of a sense. But still, I'll attempt from my experience in the last 3 to 4 years.
Or in terms of the policy? Government
Last
policy.
2 to 3 years, in terms of our engagement with the US as far as the trade dialogue is concerned, trade negotiations are concerned, trade relationship is concerned. We have seen that in the last 10 years, that is from 2007 to 2017, the trade figures grew by 2 times. It was about 58 billion in 2007. It was slightly higher than 2 times in 2017 to 126 billion. But we have seen a rapid increase in trade numbers, and that too especially from the US side, which has a huge concern relating to the trade deficit. All of you are familiar with the review undertaken by Mr. Trump immediately after his joining. And then they identified 10 topmost nations with whom US has the largest trade deficit. India was among the top 10. But in the last year itself, we have seen that there has been a huge jump in US exports, largely on account of energy requirements of India. Boeing has made this estimate that India's requirement of aircrafts in the next couple of years is going to be 2,300 aircrafts. The way our civil aviation sector is going, we will be requiring a huge number of aircrafts. Our energy requirement, both in terms of oil and natural gas, as well as coal, coke and briquette, is going to rise. Similarly, in terms of organic chemicals, there have been huge imports from US and it has grown by a huge margin. So the last time we did our counting, the US exports had grown by about 7.3 billion in the current financial year. When I am talking of financial year, I'm talking of Indian financial year. And it was growing at 35% vis-a-vis the last year. So in 2018, we expect that the combined trade between India and US is going to exceed 145 billion. The final figures are yet to come from the USTR's side. But our estimation, by taking into account the DGCI's database that we maintain, is likely to exceed 145 billion. But when we are talking of 500 billion, then naturally we have to think of a paradigm shift from what is going on till now. And I think the solution lies in the kind of initiative that both Mr. Phil Shaw and Ms. Ambika talked about. When he talked about DTTI, probably that is where a lot of solution remains to increase bilateral trade. And I think the increase in bilateral trade is not going to come only through a channel of import and export, but through a channel of bilateral investment, bilateral collaboration, and bilateral cooperation on many technology areas. There are a lot of complementarities in these areas. Our minister, Mr. Suresh Prabhu, keeps telling that India's growth, if it continues to happen at 7.5% and above, is actually in US's interest, because at this kind of a growth rate, the demand from India for different kind of consumer items, the demand for energy requirements, the demand for defense goods is only going to increase. So he keeps saying that if India grows at this pace, then within a couple of years, the trade deficit that US is complaining about, India is going to complain about that in a few years. So that time is probably not very far if we keep growing at 7.5%. As far as the areas in which such growth can happen, one is obviously in the defense segment. The other areas are what Ms. Ambika pointed out in SME collaboration. There is a huge prospect. Recently the commercial dialogue was held and we had the CEO forum where the big top honchos on both sides met. But there is no platform for SMEs for further interaction and collaboration. We are trying to stitch together a mechanism through which we can join the SMEs on both sides. In this connection, the trade winds that US is organizing, the Department of Commerce in US is organizing in May in India, is a very welcome proposition, and we hope that that will provide the initial stepping stone for SMEs on both sides to collaborate and interact much closely in future. Then in technology exports, US has a huge advantage, and in our country we have the kind of talent pool, we have the kind of enterprise and startups who can actually, with a little bit of support, with a little bit of handholding, can complement these high-tech exports from US. Similarly, in areas like robotics, artificial intelligence, there is a huge scope for collaboration between the technical institutions on both sides and leveraging the manpower, the talent pool which is available on both sides. So these are the kind of things that we'll have to look at in future. I know that on strategic and defense cooperation, our relationship is very good, especially in the backdrop of Mr. Trump's tweet, where he had mentioned that India is going to do something big in Pakistan. So he obviously had an inkling of what is happening, and that happened today morning. So on the strategic front, on the defense front, the cooperation is pretty strong. On the trade front, we have, the relationship is like the kind of a couple who will have occasional disputes, but have decided to live together and grow together. So we have decided to grow together. Our trade numbers have been growing. Bilateral trade has been improving. Our investment is increasing. There are occasional disputes relating to GSP eligibility review. There are disputes relating to market access for a few products here and there. But I'm sure that the dialogue that Ms. Sharma was discussing, we will find out a mechanism of resolving these kind of disputes and find out a mechanism to grow together and improve our bilateral trade as well as investment. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I will be happy to receive any kind of comment, suggestion or questions in future. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanjeev, for again a very good tour de force, I would say. And adding to whatever Ambika spoke about is extremely helpful. And particularly, I think the point which you made about what our minister has been saying, that the kind of growth which is happening in India will probably end up in reversing the trade deficit with US. So I don't think the US administration should be worried about it at all, but look at it in a more positive way. That is the point which is what I made before you came as well. Rob, over to you.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for Cuts for organizing this and putting this group together today. It's very good to see Pradeep Mehta and Uday and Vipul Chatterjee and others here. And congratulations, by the way, for the opening of your Cuts International Center in Washington, D.C. I know that that's up and running now and doing quite well. And I'm glad to be here on the panel with representatives of U.S. business, the U.S.-India Business Council, and also my colleagues from the Ministry of Commerce. Welcome to Frank Islam, good to see you. And Frank, I listened to your speech, so I was left a little bit confused, so maybe sometime we can meet privately and you can tell me exactly what you think about President Trump and his agenda. Anyway, very good to have a free and open and frank conversation like this. I should point out, by the way, that the U.S. Embassy, U.S. government, we have a long history of working with Cuts. Most recently, we worked together on a regional connectivity conference. It was in November in New Delhi. That was about the Indo-Pacific region and India's connections to it. We see this as a very important area for work. There's a lot more to do, and we look forward to that. I know that that's a topic for another day, because today we're here to talk about the bilateral relationship and particularly the economic aspects of it. And especially we have this question that is up here on how the U.S. and India can get to this magical number of 500 billion in bilateral trade. So let me start by saying that the overall U.S.-India relationship has grown significantly in the last 20 years. I think we all can agree on that. In areas such as defense, education, health, people-to-people ties, energy, trade, we've come a really long way. Still, there's considerable room for growth in our relationship, and this is especially true in the commercial and economic spheres. Now, I have to say, listening to some of the initial comments that came in today, that if I had just come into this room and arrived from Mars and didn't know anything about the economic situation or the two countries, and I was learning for the first time, I might think that the United States was some kind of closed economy, that we're shutting down trade and investment, that we're closing out immigration, and engaging in all sorts of protectionist types of agenda. But I didn't just fly in from Mars, and I have a lot of background on this type of thing, and I can tell you that scenario is just not true. It's not the case, and I want to talk a little bit about the perspective from the way that we see it at the U.S. Embassy and the government. So, first of all, let me just say that almost by any measure, the United States is India's largest and most important economic partner. We are the largest export for many countries around the world, the largest export market, and that's not by chance. We import nearly $3 trillion in goods and services every year, and that's because we maintain, the United States, we maintain one of the most open markets in the world with low taxes and tariffs and a stable legal and regulatory environment. Doing business with the United States is relatively predictable and easy, and that's why so many business people from around the world go there to do business. It's also why Indian investors and traders have done so well in the United States. Americans purchase nearly 20% of India's exported goods and services. So in this regard, if we want to get to the $5 billion mark, there are a few barriers on the US side that will interfere with that. So let me also say that American firms have found success in India too. We've heard about some of that today. We've heard a number of the numbers on bilateral trade and how it's doubled over the last decade. I know that goods and services exports to India from the United States have climbed to almost $50 billion over the last decade. US companies have invested heavily in India, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs here, making unparalleled contributions in research and development, offering technical training, skilling, logistics and warehousing, and incorporating India into critical global supply chains. Along the way, we recognize that India has implemented important reforms such as the adoption of GST, certain investment liberalization, new bankruptcy laws, and the likes. These actions have made the country a better place to invest and do business. Nonetheless, there are issues with market access that we have between the United States and India. Santosh is well aware of this. We've had many of these types of discussions at the Ministry of Commerce and at the Embassy. These are obstacles to these are obstacles to imports and sales in the Indian market, and they've damaged some of the US prospects for business here. Likewise, unpredictable regulatory practices, quantitative restrictions, tariff increases, and other actions, some of which frankly look like protectionist measures, have restricted some of that trade and investment as well. Right now, we're concerned that a series of new measures, particularly in regard to data localization and e-commerce policy, will hurt Indian businesses as well as our own, deter foreign investment, and stifle innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic growth here. President Trump and Prime Minister Modi agreed at the White House in June 2017 that the two countries should undertake a comprehensive review of trade relations with the goal of increasing market access in areas such as agriculture, information technology, and manufactured goods and services. That's been our goal, and we'll continue to pursue that agenda. Since there was some discussion of the deficit, since 2007, the U.S. trade deficit with India has nearly tripled, from about $10 billion to $27 billion. I'll stand by those figures because they come from the U.S. and India customs data and the authorities. I do acknowledge that recent Indian purchases of oil, gas, and aircraft, among other things, have helped stem the increase in the trade deficit and even have narrowed it. Still, we're underperforming our potential on trade. Given the sizes of the US and Indian economies and the strong rates of growth on both sides, we can do much better. We have to if we're going to get to this $500 billion mark. Let me say just a few words about investment. It has a huge impact on trade. It's not always the case that investment follows trade, but it's often the way that things work out. Individuals and companies often explore a new market through trade. If things go well, then a business entity looks to invest abroad. It's true that India's sheer size, the market here, and the strong economic growth are unmistakable and not to be ignored by businesses. It's also true, though, that there's a huge competition for investment in today's global market. Countries and regions must make a compelling case for it. In business suites in the United States, or for that matter in Canada, Europe, or Japan, or elsewhere, investors don't just look at India in terms of their investment choices. They might look at other countries, other regions. And so a country, whether it's India or it's Vietnam or it's Malaysia or any other country in the region, has to compete for those dollars. I've mentioned the need for a predictable and stable regulatory environment and understandable tax and tariff policies, and also transparent practices when dealing with local and foreign firms. I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of the global supply chain and how a country like India can fit into those supply chains and benefit from them. I often hear a lot about Make in India. I understand that initiative. It makes sense to me. I'm an American. I want to make in America. Indians want to make in India. That makes a lot of sense. When looking at these policies, though, the supply chain issues are very, very important, because not everything can be made in America. Not everything can be made in India. There has to be linkages that way. So that takes us back to the issue of regional connectivity and some of the work I was mentioning that we've done with CUTS, or for that matter with US IBC and others. We look forward to continuing that kind of work and seeing how India how we can increase the bilateral relationship on economy and trade, but also how India can interact with its neighbors, whether it's Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, for that matter, the countries in ASEAN. I think these types of relationship, that type of economic expansion, can be beneficial both to India and the United States. And so we look forward to opportunities to get that, to step up our cooperation there. So I can wrap up by saying that I think that we've been on the right track. There's a lot of progress that's been made, but we still have some distance to go. So inevitably, in any relationship, whether it's the US and India, or the US and Canada, or the US and Japan, or any other, there'll be some irritants along the way or some disagreements. This is a normal thing between countries. But we can still look at ways to increase the bilateral trade, to increase investment, to look for opportunities that will be beneficial to both sides. So I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you echoed what Santosh Shargi said, that in any marriage there are always some ups and downs, but we've agreed to live together, work together, to take it to $500 billion by 2025, or even $1 trillion by 2030. I think Frank has given us a very big target to, but I think the higher the target, the better it is. I think some of the points that you made are very important. On data localization, even our stand is a little different than what the government of India's stand is, and I think it is a little too premature to do that. The Justice Sri Krishna committee, which was set up, has drafted a bill which talks about 3 different stages of how you can manage data, rather than to RBI then jumped into the fray and said, look, I mean, one of the very simple things which comes to our mind when we talk in terms of data localization, the government thinks that all data is only going to be, collected by Indian e-commerce companies. What about foreign e-commerce companies? What about import-export? Consumers are also importing. What about that data? You can't lay your hands on that. It reminds me of the fact is that this again goes back to India-US relations. When we entered the WTO, the US and others challenged our quantitative regimes, restrictions, quantitative restrictions regime. And we lost to that. And then we realized that it will be then pointless to continue with small-scale industry reservation because the same products now you can import as well. And therefore we did away with a very large number of small-scale reservations. So it's in a situation like this, I don't know how DPIT has come out with a particular policy which I'm going to talk about in an article that I'm writing is, so why do you think that we're living in a world with national boundaries? No longer. We are living in a world which, where we have, now, on e-commerce, the fact is that we have a policy, and this is very, very important. There are political economy considerations which apply even in the US. The agriculture subsidies, for example, are so dirty. These are purely political economy issues. So similarly, we would not, this government has felt that to open up FDI and retail is anathematical to its large voting lobby, and that the same argument has now been taken forward to e-commerce in terms of retail prices. So they have done nothing else except to clarify an old policy, which is then being sort of circumvented through this kind of thing. That you can run it as a platform and allow any other goods to be traded on it, but not goods which you are manufacturing or your subsidiaries are manufacturing. Because that's a good way as to how to go around, circumvent the FDI and retail policy. I do not agree with it, but that is another point. I do not agree that we should restrict FDI and retail. A question that we have raised I was a member of the e-commerce think tank, as it were, it's no longer there, that look, why don't you apply the same rules to domestic investors? There's a discrimination. And the same thing, even the Confederation of Indian Trade has also said the same thing as we are saying. Then why are you allowing Reliance and Birlas, etc., to compete in this e-commerce space or retail space as such, whether it's offline or online or whatever it is? So that discrimination is to stop. And when we did that, of course, both USIBC and USISP have retweeted my tweet. Say, look, you can't have double standards like this. And you don't allow this thing to happen. So the fact is that we are working also on EODB. We are working with the DPIT. There is a committee which is called BRAG, a working group, Better Regulation Advisory Group. And we are trying to drill some head that look, what is happening now, and a lot of people don't understand this when your government of India is bragging about EODB figures. They say, look, this is only ease of getting permits. It is not ease of doing business. Doing business is even after you started operating, you functioning, you still have problems. The inspector, Raj, and so on and so forth. And if you don't keep them happy, then you're in a problem. But we've done, incidentally, again, with the support of the US State Department, we did this North India Competitiveness Project. Rob, I don't know whether you remember this, what happened before you came.
Yeah, I know about it.
Yeah, exactly. And we did very detailed sort of granular studies to see as to what would be the impact. And it was quite sad. Talking about SMEs particularly, they find it very difficult to cope with the kind of problems they have to face. One lady entrepreneur in Lucknow told Uday that, look, my loan has been sanctioned, but the bank man is saying, unless I give you 50,000 rupees, you give me 50,000, I'm not going to disburse the loan. And she was crying. So where is the question of ease of doing business or any kind of preferential? Anyway, this goes on and on. So I don't want to get into much detail. On IPRs, so one has to understand the political economy constraints. Both our governments have to work under. We cannot turn a blind eye to it. So I think maybe after the elections and the new government comes in, whether it's the same government or a new or any other government, is going to have at least going to probably certainly review the FDI and retail policy, which I feel. Because when there is I think something where this has $500 billion has to be linked into or dovetailed into the $5 trillion economy you're looking at, or a $10 trillion economy. That is something Mr. Saragi, which I often talk to our colleagues, they don't seem to appreciate that, look, we want to become a $10 trillion economy. How do you do that? You can't do that by practicing the same kind of protectionist measures. What will happen if we open at this or we open at that? We have to have open market. The US is an open market, as Robert said, and that is why it is able to progress so well. And why should we be afraid? Why should we be shy? I can't understand. It's only when you start competing that you start becoming more effective, in the world economy as such, which we are not doing. There's another issue which Ambika touched upon on IPRs. There is a difference of opinion between the US and India. We are following a very TRIPS compliant policy, particularly in the area of pharmaceuticals, again a very sensitive area for India. And that is something which would also request that something which needs to be understood, that compulsory licensing sanctioned by Article 8. Of course, there is an agreement between all the countries as to not to bring in a non-violation complaint in the TRIPS Council. But the fact is that we have been able to do it in as much as the US, the measure that is taken on national security grounds. If it goes before a dispute settlement body, probably, I don't know whether it can stand a test as to what are the national security considerations which the US finds now that they're able to raise the tariffs 25%. We've done that in the case of Pakistan, we raised it 200%. And I'm sure if it is challenged, we'll probably have the same problem. But we've withdrawn the MFN status, which Pakistan never gave us. That is besides the point. I mean, we're not here to discuss India. Pakistan, though Mr. Sarangi referred to a day today, which there's been sort of retaliation by India, which shows the strong political will of the government. And the strong political will of this government is what I can talk about will help in US-India relations also to go forward. One is to look at the positive side of things. And with that, may I now request to open the floor. Vijay. And please do identify yourself.
Vijay Mansur. My best introduction is I'm an old friend of Pradeep's. I got to know him when he was operating out of a little office in Jaipur. But I've been with government for a long time and had differences of opinion with a whole variety of ministers cutting across governments. I want to begin by saying that, I think Mr. Islam set the agenda today by talking about a vision. And I think Pradeep has been again talking about a vision. So my real point is that we need to broad base this vision because there are many aspects of the whole economy and about the whole social structure in this country which is expanding and changing and morphing so rapidly that this vision statement needs to be made broad-based. That's one. The second is it's a moving target. So you paint a vision today and in 5 years' time you'll probably find it needs major modification. And I'll explain that very briefly if you permit me the luxury of doing that. So what are we talking about? Until we can articulate what we want in the public domain and make the public aware of the implications of whatever politicians are talking about, we're not going to change the political thought. And I can give you 2 examples that illustrate this because, as I said, politicians in this country, very quickly, yes, politicians in this country are not really interested in the results of the economy or anything else. They pay lip service to it all the time. I mean, I've been on the dais with the civil aviation minister who was asked something about Indian Airlines, and he turned around very snooty. He said, I'm the minister for civil aviation. I'm not the minister for Indian Airlines. So talk to them.
Which is correct.
That's a good thing. No, hang on. This is a public statement. The CMD of Indian Airlines and myself and the minister are walking off the stage, and he turns to the CMD and he says, I believe you're going to introduce a new menu and you're bringing in new uniforms. I want to see them in my office too. So much for being Minister for Civil Aviation.
Thank you.
Short point I'm trying to make is we need to change the paradigm of communication to the larger thing. The hopeful thing, the best thing for us is that our janta, if I may say so, the average man, is far more interested, far more connected, and he will tie into this. And as he ties into this, that and that alone is going to change the political thought process. That's what we need to focus on.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. No.
Deepak Maheshwari, I work with Symantec, which is a cybersecurity company headquartered in the US. In fact, 1/4 of our employee base is in India, in different. So 2 points quickly. One, in things like cybersecurity, we do need, let's say, the information about what's going wrong in any part of the world, so that we can provide much better solutions to our customers and users all over the world. That's one thing. Second thing, as Ambika, you mentioned, of course, this 500 billion trade, but I still recall in June 2012, in the US Chamber of Commerce, then chairman of the US-India Business Council had also mentioned the 500 billion bilateral trade as an aspirational figure for 2020. So I think what's happening is we are seeing this 500 billion as a constant figure, but at the same time it's a moving target in terms of the time scale. So it would be useful that rather than just having this 500 billion trade figure as such, it would be useful for people to undertake some exercise so that we identify broad sectors in each direction, how much trade, and also have some roadmap, let's say over the next 5 years or so, how much progress we are going to make. Because otherwise, if it's like a 5-year or 10-year long telescopic thing, it may be just remain a mirage. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, there is already a Niti Aayog document looking at 5 trillion and a $10 trillion economy. Yeah. I don't think it has disaggregated the trade issues, which we are going to work upon. This is what I just said. I mean, how do you link it with our own aspirations? How does it, that is the way how we can then present it to the Indian public or Indian polity or Indian intelligence in order to understand that, look, this is feasible, this is how it should be done. And what it means is this is what our aspiration is. Anybody else? Hello? Yeah.
Very briefly.
Yeah, Mike, please. And introduce yourself.
Madhav Dar, I'm an anti-trust economist. Basic comment is Hexagonal theorem states that we should, whatever countries specialize in, whatever they have lots of, so the US has a lot of capital, India has a lot of labor. So we've got to focus on this. This is just a very broad point, because we have so much educated labor here which is not used enough there. And so, I mean, by cutting back on services, Mr. Trump is really doing a disservice to everyone. So, and capital investment, we need to just improve the regulatory framework. The other question, I have one question for you, Robert. One question about data localization. Do you treat the European GDPR the same way as you would India?
Because,
see,
come close to the mic.
There's going to be data protection rules everywhere. So it's only fair that you should expect that India is going to do the same thing, right?
Well, let me comment on that a little bit. First of all, we do have our issues with the Europeans on their policies on data. So there is a dialogue on that, and we've had some current concerns. From what I've seen so far in terms of the RBI, the bank's action in October, and some of the policies that are now being put forward in this new e-commerce policy that was rolled out over the weekend go far beyond what the Europeans have done. So, look, I mean, here's my impression of it, and you can take what you want out of it. India has thrived in recent years because of its IT sector, because of US investment into that, because of Indian contributions in terms of manpower and smarts and entrepreneurship and the likes. Why in the world would India want to put restrictions on its IT sector and try to clamp down and stop data flows around the world? This is the sector that has done more for your economy than almost anything else. It doesn't make any sense. So think about this. What if the United States were to say tomorrow, no, we decided that we're going to localize all data. Any data that's created in the United States has to stay there. Bangalore would go out of business in a day. It would go out of business in a day. And so why would you do that in reverse? It doesn't make any sense. No, you're killing the goose that's laying the golden egg. It's not a smart policy.
No, let me add to that. The fact is that the Indian IT sector flourished because of two factors. Silicon Valley was one. Of course, there were Indian entrepreneurs there. The second was that there was no government ministry responsible for IT. There was no government regulation. And thanks God for that. I mean, in the sense that it was very,
very nascent that time.
Very nascent at that point of time. It wasn't a millstone. Shakti, it wasn't a millstone, but anyway, yes, please, Pranav.
Yeah, very straightforward.
I know you, but
yeah, Pranav Kumar from Confederation of Indian Industry. I head the Trade Policy Division. So my question related to the roadmap which Deepak has mentioned, and this US $500 billion is very attractive and ambitious target as well. So I heard all the four panelists and of course Mr. Frank Islam. What are going to be the key enablers? Basically, we had GSP, which is under threat. We had H1B, again under threat. From US side, there were issues regarding IPR, and again on the data and e-commerce policy. We have been discussing, some debate has happened over India-US FTA also, which doesn't again look a reality in distance in near future. So if in the absence of any very concrete key enablers, how we are going to achieve this $500 billion target?
Well, that's a good point. Let me come back to Rob. Let me come. Can I take 2 more questions? Yeah. Anyone else?
So I have one more comment to make.
No, later. Let the others also take. Anybody else? No. Mr. Sarangi, you wanted to respond to Pranav?
Yeah, I partly wanted to respond to this issue relating to data localization. All of you are familiar with Secretariat Commission's report.
Yeah.
This is still a work in progress, and I think we are trying to generalize it by saying that all the IT data is going to be localized and is being asked to be kept inside the territory of India. That is not going to be the case. There are different layers of data, there are different categories of data. So RBI has prescribed this thing sometime in last April or May, only with regard to the payment companies.
Yeah.
But we should not assume that similar kind of order is in the offing for all categories of data. So that of course will come in the mandate of the parliament when it legislates.
Yeah.
But it will be wrong to assume that India is going to take an extremely hard or an extremist stance as far as the data localization is concerned. So I think on this, as in the case of e-commerce, where a draft e-commerce policy is in play, is out in the public domain asking for suggestions. So I'm sure necessary consultation with the industry stakeholders will be done before the parliament legislates on the data localization bill. As far as Mr. Pranav's and the other gentleman's question is concerned, the governments do not trade, it is the business which trades. So when you are preparing a roadmap, you are only preparing a vision document in identifying which are the areas in which possibilities can be expanded. And in this, the competitive advantage that you are talking of is of essence. So complementarities that he talked of in case of capital
And labor.
and the labor, competitiveness in terms of identifying technology and the talent pool are areas which governments can identify. Like I spoke of aircrafts, defense equipment, robotics and artificial intelligence, energy, fuel requirement. One can identify and say that this is good for reaching 500 billion, but whether it will reach 500 billion or not depends entirely on the trade and business on both sides, and secondly on improving the manufacturing capacities, the services sector capabilities in both the sectors. And this is not going to be possible by playing an overtly protectionist policy. If somebody thinks that by putting a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium, I'll make our industries more competitive, it's not possible.
On the contrary.
So is the case with India. If we take an overtly protectionist stance in different areas. Take for example soybean. This is the largest exported item from US to, used to be the largest exported item from US to China. 35 million tons of soybean worth about $14 billion used to be exported. Tomorrow if I am saying that I can substitute this by improving my soybean then I have a number of measures to take. Starting from productivity, identifying areas, identifying the kind of seeds which will give me that productivity. It's not going to happen overnight. It will take a whole lot of time. So, so the roadmap can identify areas, but on the sidelines, a lot of measures relating to ease of doing business, actually ensuring our manufacturing capabilities, ensuring that our services sector is improved. A lot of back-end work will be required, especially on the part of India, if we want to scale up our exports.
No, I agree with you, Mr. Sangi, very well, and I'm glad you made these very sensible responses you shared with us. The fact is that business has to wake up and grab the opportunities, and as government or as think tanks or somebody, we can only identify the areas that we think can grow, including on this. Just Robert, just one question on which has not been raised, and this is again a bone of contention, is on totalization. The social security, India has been able to achieve a totalization agreement with about 10 or 15 countries, but not with the US, and billions of dollars are lying there. Which the Indian labor would have lost. And this is something which needs to be sorted out among other kind of things. But Mr. Sangi, the point which you made, and this is something which I have also written about, is that we need to at least start preparing a roadmap for a US-India FTA. In the sense that we know exactly, what is it that has to happen, and what are the red lines for both. We know on an ad hoc basis, we know exactly, and hither and thither we keep on hearing about things, but is it collected? Is there a comprehensive document which talks about the roadmap? There's none. And there's one study which is done by Hemant Krishna Singh he was then with ICRIA, now he was the Delhi Policy Group, I don't know whether he's here. But that was the only study which was done about 10 years ago. Rob, would you like to respond?
Well, let me just say on a couple of these issues that have come up. On the totalization issue, I understand it's an issue that the government in India has wanted to pursue with us for a number of years. We've looked into that. It would take changes in legislation and other types of things, and so it's something we can look at that way. We do have some agreements with countries around the world, so we can explore that. I'll note though that in terms of these types of agreements, we've tried to make arrangements on things like bilateral investment treaties and other areas where we haven't been able to come up with agreements as well. So these things can be quite difficult. I know that when our new ambassador, well, he's not new anymore, but when our ambassador arrived about a year and a half ago in India, he gave a policy speech early on, and he floated the idea of what would it take for the U.S. and India to have a free trade agreement. And free trade agreements can cover all sorts of issues like these. We haven't gone down that path on a free trade agreement, but honestly on the Indian side there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in pursuing that with the United States. We are pursuing other avenues of trade, narrower packages and things like this, but not a broader free trade agreement. So maybe someday that will be in the cards, but right now we haven't had those discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know, I agree with you. I mean, this is the feeling that we've also got. Would be that, would it?
Right. Just to extend this discussion on the roadmap, and I think one of the commonalities between India and the US is also the fact that we also have federal structure. And I think in this whole emphasis on cooperative federalism, the question is open to anybody to answer. How do you foresee the role of states coming in? And how can we ensure that the fact that the roadmap, which as and when it comes up and is being formulated, it's more of a bottom-up approach and not really a top-down approach. So that's one. And second, just for the benefit, just to extend the debate and the discussion on data localization, I think what also requires to be undertaken in India is that we do have plethora of regulations, but I think undertaking cost-benefit analysis of regulations before they are being adopted, I think that's extremely critical. And just to share the knowledge that as cuts, we are undertaking a study right now where we are doing a consumer impact assessment of the data localization and the draft bill, and we should be out with our findings in next 3 months for the benefit of the polity. So thank you very much.
USIBC's perspective, we have taken this as a major focus, and we started the 2019 with a very robust strategy by getting the governors from the Kentucky and North Carolina, the Secretary of State. And this year's theme for our India Idea Summit is only going to be states and cities. And when we talk about the seriousness in achieving this 500 billion trade target, in fact, we had a very detailed discussion and debate in the Prime Minister's presence almost 6 months back, and I'm very happy to share with you that keeping the irritants, the barriers aside, which you highlighted very well, we have already created a 10-sector roadmap and presented to the Prime Minister. This, I'd be very happy to share that, because already the work is in progress, whether it comes to the cooperative federalism or when it comes to the setting the stage for the 500 billion, rather than always talking about this without the timelines in the next 5 years. And I'm very hopeful that while these irritants we have been talking about, and my colleague, I would like to introduce my colleague Sandeep Samadar, who is already in the audience. He would like to share some views on the high technology export, which nobody has touched so far in the conversation.
Just to add, and to also respond to Deepak when he mentioned that in 2012 at the US Chamber, the roadmap was discussed as to be 500 billion, and we have just shifted the goalpost. But you must also remember in 2012, I mean, we had just managed to get into the areas where there are restrictions on high technology exports were getting removed. Because previously it was certainly what we used to call as a sort of a technology denial regime, which India used to be facing. But from there we have gone, India has moved a great deal. I mean, we have signed a number of those multilateral regimes, and the flow of technology and these things have become much more freer. So, which is one of the things which we feel that one of the fillip to our 500 billion trade is going to be the high technology trade. So this is one of the things that ability to India to have managed to have signed the Wassenaar, the Australia group, the nuclear supply group. So not the nuclear supply group, but we are at least compliant to it. So yeah.
You have a paper on that. Thank you. Yes, please.
Sorry, I missed a lot of this, but just a very basic point.
Please identify.
My name is Shakti Sinha. I'm the director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Sorry to have missed. You know, you have been at it for a long time. If you go anywhere discussing trade, exports are good, imports are bad. As long as you have that attitude, we are going to keep talking. So what does one do to tell people that actually imports are very good for you?
Yeah, right. That's a good question, and we've written quite a lot on that particular, sort of proverb that look, imports are as good as exports, depending on.
My food that I eat is better than the income I get, but it.
Rob, would you like to respond? Santosh?
Well, I think that Santosh and I will agree on this one. I mean, the trade is good, but when you expand trade, you create advantages for both sides on this. And one thing you have to remember on when it comes to imports create jobs too.
Yeah.
I was talking about supply chain, for example. Things come in, they get assembled. Perhaps components are made for export, but other components come in, they get assembled, their jobs related to that, they go elsewhere. I mentioned things like logistics and warehousing. You go out to the airport and you look around, all of the, whenever there's trade coming in, the cargo is unloaded, could be a port, it could be an airport. There are all sorts of jobs related to that. Transport, truckers that do this sort of thing, insurance and freight forwarders, bankers and everyone else. So there is huge advantage to this on both ends. And I realize that, all countries worry about lopsided trade. I mentioned the trade deficit. I know India is concerned about its trade deficit with China and so forth. So we will find some balance in this sort of thing, but more trade is better. That's why we're talking about 500 billion. It's a good thing for both sides.
On this, The answer lies in the distinction between economics and political economics. So, I mean, in the recent past, we have been criticized for putting quantity restriction on pulses.
Yeah.
So today, if I allow pulses, then pulses will land here at 20 rupees a kilo. And our minimum support price is 52 rupees per RR.
The most popular dal.
And today from Canada, the yellow peas can land here at 18 to 19 rupees a kilo. The tur can land from Africa at 20 to 23 rupees a kilo.
Yellow peas is kabli chana.
No, kabli chana is your chickpeas. Yellow peas is your yellow matar. इसमें आपका घुगनी वगैरह होता है.
Dal, chने की dal.
This is more used on the eastern coast of India, where Bengal, Odisha, वो ज़्यादा खाते हैं. And that's a substitute for pulses in eastern part of India. And sometimes that is also used in besan. So आपका जो बेसन normally ग्राम से होता है, वो sometimes yellow matar is also mixed to make cheaper besan. So the distinction is there only, and I think all the bureaucrats, economists will understand the point which you made, but the government will still keep on doing it.
I mean, you cannot ignore political economy.
No, I don't.
In any decision making. Phil, would you like to? Good. With that, I think we come to a conclusion, and we are running decidedly on time. One of the best events that I've been able to manage. Please don't get up. We are not end. There is a vote of thanks and a summary by my senior colleague Bipul Chatterjee. Bipul.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, other panelists. Of course, let me first begin by thanking Mr. Islam for your thought-provoking speech, which I have read a number of times. Anyway, my job is to conclude this session, and thanking all of you. I'm not going to go by what speakers have said, but let me, a number of data which has been said. Over this evening. So I'm not going into those details. All I would say that we're not going to achieve, if we go by this rate of growth of our bilateral trade, we are going to achieve about 300 billion by 2025, and it will take another 5 years or so. So by 2030, we're going to achieve 500 billion bilateral trade.
Not 1 trillion.
Not 1 trillion. So I'll come to that point. So the larger point is that if we take the business as usual approach, which unfortunately we are taking, then certainly we are not going to achieve this. We have to shift our goalpost further, which is not good for these two largest democracies of this world, which is not good for our producers, which is not good for our consumers. So we have to go beyond this this business as usual approach, and we have to change the narrative. So I like the word paradigm shift, which I think Mr. Sarangi has spoken about, or I guess Rob has spoken about. So how are we going to do that? That's the larger question which we need to address. I think the roadmap which Ambika has outlined, I think that's one of the key pillars taken together, those 5 points, in taking an approach which is not business as usual, which can shift the paradigm of our bilateral trade. And in order to do that, I think Rob has pointed out that at the moment, the United States, they are importing about $3 trillion worth of goods and services. Our portion of that is just about 2.5% of that. How are we going to increase that portion? And by 2030, your import is going to be about $500 trillion. So how are we going to get about 5% of that, doubling of what we are doing at the moment? That's one way of looking at it. Similarly, we have to also, I understand the word, the meaning of the word balance. At the same time, we have to also understand that there is huge difference in our purchasing power between these two. nations. And therefore, we need to look at areas, and I like this point by Rob, that we shouldn't just look at trade per se, not trade in isolation, but trade along with investment and technologies. So I would end by saying that you need to remove all these irritants. I don't use the word barriers or measures no longer. So they are irritants. We don't yet know what are the devices that we need to apply to remove these irritants of our bilateral trade, but it's possible in my opinion. So I'll end by saying that Indo-US FTA is definitely a way forward. So how are we going to create a discourse, a better informed discourse, in order to set the stage for such a negotiation for a bilateral FTA? And here I am talking about deep agreement, not this shallow agreement that we are very much used to. So by deep agreement, I mean a number of areas on which we are at the moment not very comfortable, like competition, like investment, like e-commerce and things like that. So we need to think beyond 2025, beyond 2030. We need to think about 2050, the 100th year of our independence, and see how we can avoid this middle income trap in which we are and become a high income economy. If not high, then at least mid to high income economy in terms of our per capita income and things like that. So I think technology transfer and investment, they are going to be the key, other than just bilateral trade in goods and services. If I look at the growth in services, I think that's much more than our growth in trade in goods. So technology and investment, so we look forward to more and more private sector engagement, American private sector engagement in India, and not just in India. Let me end by saying this. I look for a larger market in our immediate neighborhood as well as in our extended neighborhood. So you have to also look at this subject of bilateral trade and investment and technology transfer between India and the United States in the larger Indo-Pacific context. In our immediate neighborhood, I'm talking about the East, I'm not talking about the West, not much, and in our extended neighborhood in the Indo-Pacific context. So if we can align all these things, our Act East policy, our trade and connectivity initiatives in the eastern side, our Bay of Bengal region, and beyond that, along with the objectives of Asia Reassurance Initiative Act of the United States, then I think it is possible for us to achieve $1 trillion bilateral trade maybe before 2030. I am an optimist, so maybe before 2030. But for that, we need to have a very clear roadmap, and we are looking forward to work with the USIBC, with the Indian government, with the US government, and other stakeholders, major stakeholders, to achieve this. So let me end by thanking once again all of you, particularly Mr. Islam, our panelists, and all of you for taking your time to attend this event. And let me assure you that we are going to take forward this agenda, not in a business as usual approach, but in a much more innovative